And I'm hitting the go live button now. It'll just take a couple of seconds.
Okay.
And we are live.
Good afternoon, everyone. Deborah McGregor here from York University and the Indigenous Environmental Justice Project. We're offering an event for Indigenous History Month, our first one, even though lo and behold, it's the middle of the month. So I know I should say good morning and good afternoon, because some of you may be in different parts of the country and experiencing this talk at different time zones. So we're so thrilled to have Mikinaak here today to present. I'm just thrilled that they agreed to do this. I've known Mikinaak a long time and love the art, so I'm just going to do a little plug for the Anishinaabe series. This is the artwork that I've always super loved. With actually, I realize another one that we need to hopefully try to finish up this summer sometime. We also have Alan Corbière to join in the discussion today. He's a professor in history at York University. So we're thrilled to have him here as well. So the way that we've been approaching Indigenous History Month is very broad, like a very broad kind of understanding of history. On our website, you'll see a talk by Alan a couple of years ago where he talked about different conceptions of history and time and understanding Indigenous history. What does that look like? And our perspective has been to take a broad view. And in light of I want to acknowledge, I'm wearing my orange shirt today, what's happened. I didn't want to call it a discovery because, of course, people knew that. It's just been, the truth has come out about what the survivors were saying in Kamloops, that history is still very contemporary in our lives. It's not in the past. It still plays out in the work that we do and the history that we do. So in light of that, the approach that we've always taken is a very broad view. Like really, I find we're often in a position of just trying to educate the public on whatever. People just don't know very much about Indigenous people, and it's really important to hear from Indigenous people about their own experiences and to think about Indigenous perspectives and lived experience through different lenses. So we're just really thrilled to have Mikinaak here today to look at it through the art, which is far more interesting than reading a bunch of text. So really happy that they were able to join us today. So you'll have seen in the post that the presentation is Art Against Settler Colonialism, which is pretty exciting. Oh, not sure what's happening there, but. And I'll just go through the bio. So Migwans is a member of the Wiikemikoong unceded territory and assistant professor of Indigenous contemporary art in Canada at the University of Toronto, with a cross appointment as curator of Indigenous art at the U of T Art Museum. And I don't live too far. I guess my community is about a 45-minute drive, probably faster by boat. So we're practically neighbors when we're up north. Their research and pedagogy is focused on Indigenous relations in museum and gallery settings, the power of markers and the politics of placemaking, with special attention to weaving, women, water relations in the Northeast. Their dissertation at Columbia University explores the natural fiber weaving traditions of the Great Lakes, especially the bulrushes, what Renee Boston-Dillard, hopefully I said that right, has called the first water protectors. Migwans has worked with the Great Lakes Research Alliance for the study of Aboriginal arts and culture at Carleton University, the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation in Inchigang First Nation, and the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa. Amazing artist again. Really enjoyed working with Mikinaak over the years, and really looking forward to this presentation and then questions and answers and some of the discussion afterwards. So with that, I will turn it over to Mikinaak to introduce yourself, however you might, and further if I didn't do this justice, and a bit of the talk. So again, just so grateful that you're here, and really just looking forward to this. I love art. It's incredible. Right. I always love art.
Amazing. Thank you very much for bringing me here, Miigwech, Deb, and Miigwech, Alan. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started on what I was going to present today. All right, how's that? Good. All right, so I am, as I said, Migwans. I'm a member of Wiikemikoong Unceded territory up on Manitoulin. Formerly, some of you might know me as Crystal Migwans. I would like to go by they them pronouns for anyone asking questions, or if we have a conversation after. But I don't mind any pronouns; those are fine. My talk today is going to be about art against settler colonialism, which I've just qualified a bit to talk about Indigenous art against colonialism, and I want to talk specifically about the struggle that artists and activists and culture workers have been undertaking in different kinds of museums. Some of the art that I think, just to demonstrate the breadth of what I'm referring to as art, and not only activism that is art, or art that is about activism, but the kind of art that does the cultural work in the world that as Indigenous people we look to our leaders to perform, right? So one of the first person I always start with is Rebecca Belmore here with her very important piece, artifact number 671B in 1988 in Thunder Bay. This one, which Leanne Martin has written about extensively, is for me a real starting point, especially in Canadian Indigenous art history, just for driving home the point that Indigenous contemporary art in Canada, but more widely, has always been based in action, in justice, and in bringing to light the causes that we're struggling for in Indigenous territory, right? This one I'm going to talk a little bit more about later, but just to start us off, this is the case of a performance artist, someone who was working within the art world at the time, and probably one of the most recognizable artists in Canada today, doing this protest piece as part of a performance, right? So something that is talked about in art discourse that is also this an action that is outside this museum. Another piece that I like to talk about is this one, Isaac Murdoch's Thunderbird Woman. So Isaac Murdoch and Christy Belcourt, as part of the Onaman Collective, I'm really interested in the work they do as artists and as activists, right? And making this piece in particular available to do its work in the world in support of the Standing Rock and other land protection matters in recent years from 2016. I believe this one was originally made in, was it 2016 or 2017? And then the screen prints, the images online have been distributed and made available as Creative Commons so that they're able to kind of go out into the community and do their work, so that you can make banners. As you can see here, the Pelletier family there in Espanola are doing are participating in that water protection work. As well, this image has also appeared and it lends itself really well to these applications in justice work here, where they painted it on the street outside Wells Fargo, which was one of the key financiers of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was so central to the case at Standing Rock, right? And again, that these kinds of art modes that Indigenous artists are working within are so fundamentally community-based, right? It's things that are about being able to bring us back into good relationship with each other and making life possible for other Indigenous people, right? And in making it possible for us to be together and be creative in a world that is in a settler colonial context that continually kind of suppresses us, right? I'd also like to include under the rubric of art these kinds of actions, because they are about intervening in monuments in the first case, and monuments are one of the fundamental topics of art history, right? Of public art and of marks in the public realm that make clear the ethics and the aesthetics even of the state. So not only the monuments themselves, but Indigenous and colonized peoples making interventions upon the monuments, and even in this case, taking them down. This was moments before this monument, this Ryerson Monument, one of the on whose report residential schools in Canada was based, before he was taken down in a triumphant triumphant move. I want to think about this as art again because it is something about a creative intervention, and it's about something that arises out of a sense of community, even if it's a community sense of grief, even if it's a community sense of anger, a way of making a mark on the world, on making a mark on this kind of settler colonial incursion into our lives or in our territories, and being able to express that in a creative and community way. I want to stress too that it's not just about what I'm calling this kind of art action or an art-based intervention, right? A visual demonstration of a community and of collective grief. That it's not just about what people see as this act of violence against a statue, which is a piece of property. It's inanimate. It's not a human. It's a piece of property that is being so-called vandalized, right? And the real action, I believe, that we should focus. Whenever we see these images of paint on monuments or monuments being dismantled, that what we're not seeing, what's outside that frame, is the community that's there, right? The way that the community has come together, the anger, the grief that they feel, but also the creative force and the power of being together. That is what's outside that frame here. And so this is what this picture is showing. Some of those initial activists who went to that site in order to pay their respects to the 215 children who were found at the site of the Kamloops Residential School. Not only to them, but to all the others who are in unmarked graves who we know to be the case that they are missing, and we hold that grief. And sometimes these things come out. But I want to talk about them in terms of art, because art has been such a key place for the expression of this grief, for this not only expression of grief, but the expression of a way forward, what to do, right? How to, and in that case, artists have led us forward in that respect so many times. One of the key things that I look to when I'm thinking about art actions, as the term goes, is this AntiColumbus Day Tour, as it was called, at the American Museum of Natural History in New York in 2016. For me, this is a point that I like. This is an example I like to come back to because it illustrates these communities, different communities, who are allying together on Columbus Day. This one, each year, this has become a recurring event in order to make interventions upon a statue, which it's a little bit hard to see here, but is famous for its depiction of racial hierarchy. Basically, it's the Teddy Roosevelt monument, where he's sitting on top of a horse, kind of leading, going forward heroically into the future. And on his left and right sides, below and subordinate to him, are an anonymous, unnamed Indigenous man on the other side, and his feather bonnet, of course, and on the other side, an anonymous African man, again leading his reins and on the ground and going forward. This has become fairly a place to gather and demonstrate what the struggle for all these communities is about, right, and how it's rooted together. I think of this in particular because of the ways that it's that they're making this art action, this kind of this gathering is about showing what the future we want looks like. And it's for this is a parachute. This is the way that they decided to make a mark on this statue at that time was to put a parachute over it in order to erase it, in order to say we want this taken down, right? How do we do that? Well, in this case, we're going to show what we want by covering it up with this parachute, right? With this big cloth. I think a method that has also been proven very effective in this recently and in the past couple of years has been taking the monument down ourselves, because we can't reliably call upon institutions to do that for us. This is also an interesting case because it shows Indigenous and related communities in an ethnographic museum. So this is a natural history. American Museum of Natural History is kind of notable as this kind of this originary site of this sort of this complex of ethnographic and anthropological museums, right? As they've existed in the United States and Canada. So the way that it has these diagrams, the way that it has these kinds of nature halls interspersed with cultural halls of cultures that are assumed to be primitive or before culture, the ones that didn't make it into the metropolitan across the way, right, until recently. But this kind of action, intervening against the ethnographic museum, is something that is familiar to us and something that's interesting to me because it's becomes such an enduring site of resistance for Indigenous people, because of this well-known history, this very well-known history of exploitation and extraction that has been critiqued as representing, right? And again, behind this, all these actions, there are Indigenous people coming together, there's community. So there's not, we often see in the news reports this kind of the quote unquote violence against the monument and the sort of the marks that have been made on the monument. But those reports usually fail to capture the community and the life building activities that are at the around the base of those interventions. Building on this is the way that these actions have bled over into the art museum and the ways that they find their appropriate target of critique in the art museum as much as it's in the ethnographic museum. So this is an interesting action during this AntiColumbus Day Tour, where they moved from that Natural History Museum across on the one side, the west side of Central Park in New York City, and they moved across to the art museum, where it's assumed that recent inclusions of Indigenous art within the American galleries, for instance, or the inclusion of Indigenous ancestral arts in these masterpiece contexts would be enough to kind of mollify the anger of oppressed peoples. Not the case, as these kinds of actions make another very important critique, right? Not only of the Metropolitan, but of the Whitney, of the MoMA, of other art institutions which consider themselves to be the kind of solution to the problem posed by the ethnographic museum. So what this protest was saying, they're saying they want the art, not the people, right? They want to put the art up. They want to take the art that is done by oppressed peoples. They want to put it up. They want to put a frame around it. And then but they don't want the people who are attached to them. They don't want the world that represents outside the museum, those extractive realities, to come with them into the museum. I want to linger on this a little more and see what is behind these, and see what kinds of interventions in the art museum are being done by Indigenous artists, especially, and to compare the kinds of different struggles that exist in the ethnographic versus the art museum, and as well make some suggestions maybe for or start a conversation that I hope can be useful to artists as they continue to lead our people in this struggle for decolonization. This one is another key event in which Maria Hupfield and Reagan DeLoggins, both artists, did an action at the Whitney Biennial, in which there were some Indigenous artists who were represented there and were being celebrated. And they went in and did this art action in a context in which the Whitney was being critiqued for one of its board members having profiting directly from settler colonial contexts of violence, right? Elsewhere, here and elsewhere. And it just becomes part of this, a larger critique of the ways that our art is brought into the institutions in which these kind of settler colonial policies are being made possible, and that our inclusion in them often comes at the expense of the actual artist, right? So the artists themselves, everything that they represent, everything that every part of the struggle that they represent, and that the communities that they are trying to bring in with them through their art are being cut off and kind of let out, right? So this is an action that I thought was really important, as something that is not protesting the Indigenous works that are in there, not protesting the Indigenous artists that are in there, but that it's protesting the kind of system that makes our struggles and makes our voices so difficult to actually hear. So, having recalled some of these histories of Indigenous artists and activists in the Ethnographic Museum, I want to think about how those relations might be also present in the Art Museum, right? So, the basic matter is this, I think. So we know what the struggle is about in the Ethnographic Museum, okay? It's about plunder, colonialism. Like, the critiques have been very thoroughly made, and the interventions have been very fruitful for the most part, like repatriation, consultation, community engagement, and sometimes advocacy, all right? These are things that we've won in the Ethnographic Museum. We've made relationships there. We've made progress in terms of bringing back our relatives and actually reviving some of what those colonial extractive histories have kind of severed in our communities. So these changes have been about readmitting into the realm of presence, life, and futurity the Indigenous peoples that empire has rendered like past, other, ownable. So we reclaim our ancestors, lineages, belongings, and languages. And in other words, we are let out of the museum, out of the glass case, and back into the world, right? The struggle in the art museum, we thought, was different, or it's assumed is different. Here we demanded admittance. For a long time, Indigenous artists have struggled for admittance to the art museum because we'd been so thoroughly relegated to the ethnographic museum that agency and expression were made impossible for us, right? So here, the task of what's typically termed inclusion was for us about overcoming a strategic settler colonial exclusion. But in the logic, I think, of the liberal democratic state, which we must always remind ourselves is still the settler state, social and racial justice is about being rescued from the dark halls and dioramas of the ethnographic museum and brought into the modern light of the art museum, right? So what I'd like to think about now is the logic of this journey from ethnographic to art, right? From museum to museum, and how these institutions might fundamentally be very much the same, right? And to help us think a little bit differently about this, I'd like to bring forth another dualism that I think sits at the base of what the museum is, which is the relationship of property. So the owner to that which is owned. So I would like to suggest that this dualism, the object and the owner, the agent, I guess, this is the dualism that must be breached, right? In order to reclaim objects as kin, as actual beings, relatives, ancestors even, sisters and brothers in the struggle, right? Not things that can be whose relations are severed once they are acquired into the art museum, but things that are ongoing in their activation, right? How to make sure that those relatives, once they enter the art museum, if that's where they're intended to go, if that's their destination, how do we make sure that they are still active and speaking and doing things, and how to make sure that they are not kind of silenced and made inert by the process of acquisition, I think. So I'd like to suggest that this is the dualism that must be breached in order to reclaim objects as kin and to resist ongoing processes of colonial accumulation. So this is the task of the art museum, I think, in the art museum as much as in the ethnographic museum. So having said that, I'm going to try to briefly go through some of the tension, this is a little bit from my museum's lecture, but I think this is necessary to kind of try to think through some of the dynamics that are in the ethnographic versus the art museum in order to kind of make a productive ground for conversation later. So in the ethnographic museum, of course, we know that we and our objects become specimens, all right? So earlier anthropology adopted these classificatory systems from natural history, right? So under which natural cultural objects became specimens, so evidence of the maker's place in an evolutionary scheme. You can see here, come on, next one. This is a page from the Lewis Henry Morgan's publication, in which this is one of the fathers of early anthropology, in which he lays out this kind of this way of taking the evidence collected as objects from other peoples and using it as evidence to determine their position in this kind of this linear path towards civilization that was assumed to be kind of universal, that some people were in savagery, some in barbarism, some in civilization. So these objects were taken and recast, right? So once they are taken by the ethnographic collecting institution, they are no longer what they were before. Now they are evidence, they are specimens, they are recreated into something that is evidence of the otherness, basically, of these, the people that they were taken from. This, of course, was changed in later, or the ways that anthropology kind of shifted was, especially with Franz Baum. He was the one who took that previous model of objects as evidence of the culture's position in this one universal line from savage to civilized, and he wanted to talk about cultures. So this is the kind of where we get the culture model, is Franz Baum, where he says, all right, so objects, instead of being compared against objects from other cultures, all the objects should be considered within the frame of that culture's own stories, languages, and practices. All right, so he's the kind of origin of what we see today in these museums, where you have different cultures in different boxes, right? So this is, in this example you can see here, this is the Hall of Northwest Coast Indians in its original installation in 1900, in which you can see all of these different objects from each cultural area in their own specific box so that they can contextualize each other. And then this practice of the life group display, in which you can see those objects being used. So he thought, for him, this was a dramatic departure from what had come before. But you can see, I think it's been well critiqued, the ways that this system is also deeply othering, right? I think we're well familiar by now with the idea that we should not be, that what it is to put someone in a frame, right? What it is to put someone within a glass vitrine and give the public this vantage of authority, right? Especially when those cultural objects have been taken from the community and taken out of that social life en masse, right? And this is just, again, this is something just to remind us of what that larger history of Indigenous people with museums is. This is a quote from the Indian Act as it was modified in 1884 in order to ban the potlatch, and was used as a premise in 1922 in order to arrest a potlatching community, arrest like 40 people in this potlatching community, and steal all of their items, and in order to try to clamp down on these traditional practices. These are a series of masks that are being displayed that had been confiscated from these potlatchers under this Indian Act, and brought into and put in this display and documented before being sold to not only ethnographic museums but art collectors as well, right? So Gustav Heye, for instance, Museum of the American Indian, which we might think of on the model of an ethnographic museum, but he was an art collector, right? He collected these things and he made a museum on this kind of masterpiece format. So all of these things were collected and made in that interaction into specimens or art. They were made into something that could be owned and sold, and then these guys there's a long process of returning those community members back, right? These community members, as well as those who had been arrested. And here they are. This is the Umista Cultural Center, which they built in order to receive those things back, right? Because one of the things that once a museum object becomes a museum object, the museum will refuse to have it admitted back into life proper. It has to be returned to a museum. So they built a museum in the form of a traditional ceremonial house with museum conditions, so that they could return the objects to this place, use them in ceremony, but still have a place that the museum would allow them to be returned to. This is, I think, deeply related to the issue that Rebecca Belmore, who I mentioned before, was protesting, as well as many other communities, the Lubicon Cree, as well as across Canada. This is another key moment in Canadian Indigenous art history. Not so much for the exhibition itself, but for the actions, the ways that those actions led us towards change, right? So this is an exhibition at the Glenbow Museum, which was sponsored by Shell Oil, and was being put up as this kind of as one of the key attractions besides the 1988 the Winter Olympics, right? It was this big thing sponsored by Shell Oil. The Lubicon Cree at the time, though, Shell, they were trying to get their land rights, eh? And Shell was up there drilling on their lands, and they were trying to protest. They were trying to protest that their cultural belongings were in a museum doing the work of covering for this Shell gas company, right? Working against the interests of the community, right? So they were protesting the complicity of the art museum, or in this case, it's an art/ethnographic museum, the Glenbow. The complicity of this museum in the settler colonial incursions of multinational companies and of the state into their territory, right? Because that's what's going on behind all of these things. So they were protesting not only the use of their objects towards this end, but also the exclusion of actual Indigenous people from these spaces. So that it was not an exhibition that included contemporary makers or gave in any way an indication that it was there were living peoples, right? So to drive that point home, you can see here how these objects are put in vitrines, right? Which is the classic way of making something other, dead, an example and an example to be looked upon. So here, Rebecca put herself in this this vitrine here, and she sat herself outside in like minus 20-degree weather, outside of she wasn't in Calgary, it was the Thunder Bay Art Gallery. She sat herself out there and labeled herself Artifact 671B. And she puts Glenbow Museum Presents The Spirit Sings, sponsored by Shell Gas. You can't see the Shell Gas, but it's down there. And this is in order to show herself to show the kind of relationship that has been enacted in putting this exhibition on, right? In this Indigenous territory, in offense of Indigenous rights. She's saying we are being made into objects that speak for a cause that is counter to our own, right? And we are being made into something that is inert, voiceless. And in doing so, she was also protesting how Indigenous artists were excluded from the realm of the contemporary, of the active, of the making, of the creating kind of agents that would be considered artists, right? So this is a key moment. This is also, I think, a key point about the difference between the Ethnographic Museum and the Art Museum. So one of the ways that the Art Museum distinguishes itself from the display modes of the Ethnographic Museum is this kind of what we call this modernist style of art display, right? So rather than having what we showed before, hold on, like this life group makeup where all the objects are kind of contextualized with each other. None of the objects are really highlighted. They're kind of shown as evidence of this kind of othered life way. In this case, they're shown as masterpieces. So the masterpiece model is considered to elevate the object to this kind of, almost to agentive status, right? Almost to something that can speak on its own and that you can have a kind of one-on-one, almost soulful or spiritual experience with, sort of a point of contact with the genius or the artistic soul of the artist. Notably, the processes by which these objects came to be in the museum do not differ in any significant way from the ways that objects come to be in the Ethnographic Museum, right? So pieces like this mask, which I believe is an example of one of these Northwest Coast, probably might be a New Shock mask. In any case, there's another carved ancestor in the back there, and another of other, what I assume to be argillite pieces in there. Although some of them might have come into the museum at this point in 1941, some of them were coming into the museum as art pieces that were being made in the community and sold in order to, as part of this emerging wage labor practice. Fundamentally, a lot of the objects in the MoMA, in the Metropolitan, and all these art museums came from those same systems of extraction and exploitation and all these colonial histories, right? So the ways that the display differs, the way that you're supposed to make a connection with these objects, though it's different, and this is still the kind of dominant mode of display in art museums, right? You isolate the object, you give it beautiful lighting, you elevate it, you make sure that there's space around it, you make it a one-on-one encounter with something that is considered to be like this spark of artistic, some sort of pure contact with this artist. And it's harder to read into this art museum situation the ways that state power and colonial extraction is still present in these, not only in the histories of acquisition of the objects, but in the modes of display, right? So this idea that you are here in order to almost one of the prominent critics of the art museum called it in order to worship at the altar of culture, right? To come and be incultured and come to learn how to be a citizen of the multicultural democracy. So the indoctrination, the kind of learning how to be a citizen and being part of this state is part of this display just as much as in the Ethnographic Museum, or more, because it's harder to see the kind of the techniques of power as they're in play in this kind of museum. And I don't see also, once it comes down to it, the kind of modes of display that divorce these objects from the facts of their relations, right? the facts that these were used for someone, that they were used to keep someone alive, that someone made these, someone used these, someone had ideas or feelings about certain ones of these. The ways that it tidies all those facts of Indigenous life away from the object in order to allow it to be like appropriated into someone else's meta historical narrative about where this culture fits in an ordering of civilizations, or where this culture fits in this one history of the world. All the things that were cut out of that object in order to make it something that could represent a culture or represent a people in a museum. That process is not different, I think, from the one that you'll find in the art museum, all right? And so here you can see this, again, this installation view of Indian art in the United States in 1941. Again, this is at the Museum of Modern Art, which we had to fight long and hard in order to gain admittance to at all, right? As artists and not as kind of like nameless primitive sources for modernist art. I think it's fundamentally, especially in this case, about the same process of extraction. So here we have membranous bowls, which again are grave items taken from the ground and kind of circulated in this very intense collector's milieu from basically the 1920s onward until every membranous site was completely razed. All of these graves, all these things taken from the faces of the dead and circulated as art. They were, as part of these art economies, became masterpieces, and they were in exhibitions like this, were raised up as masterpieces. What they meant to those people, and even the fact that they were grave goods, was obscured in order to make them an object that could be admired aesthetically, right? So the conditions in which we are able to view something in this disinterested, abstracted art way, those are the same conditions that allowed those objects to be taken from us in the first place, all right? These processes of extraction, that is what makes these objects available for artistic consideration. I think what the task for Indigenous, I do want to talk about this. This is one of the key cases in museum studies, and this is from an article by Margaret Bruchac that really set my thinking about the role of privatization and the role of acquisition in colonial dispossession, right? Not only from land, but from our objects, and in the dispossession of objects from their meanings, right? From their social meanings and the ways that they hold up our world. So this is a case in which cultural property was reframed as private property in order to facilitate acquisition into not only the ethnographic museum, but also the art museum, all right? So Marge Bruchac was talking about this one situation recently in 2009 in which a number of Onondaga, I believe it was Onondaga belts, wampum belts came up for sale at Sotheby's. This had happened before, and they had an agreement with Sotheby's that if something like this came up again, Sotheby's would contact them and they would get that repatriation system sorted out. Because by this point, 2009, repatriation has been an issue for a long time. They had in the past been able to work it out with the Sotheby's officials and help them understand why it was so important that the original communities had these belts. This time, however, in this situation, they were faced with a very old kind of rebuttal, right? They were faced with a kind of rejection that we're very familiar with, and that is ongoing, I think, and is the key kind of settler colonial dynamic that we're fighting now more than ever. And it relies on this suggestion that these objects have already been alienated from their contexts, and that they are no longer active as things that have meaning and social force in our Indigenous communities, all right? They're saying that they have become relics, and the evidence of that is simply that they are in a museum in the first place. So in 1892, it's like 100 years before, a Haudenosaunee chief sold 4 of his belts to a collector. And because the Haudenosaunee Council and those systems of accountability were still firmly in place at the time, he was immediately deposed. And the Onondaga immediately sued for the belt's return. They're like, that wasn't his to sell. We would like those back, please. The judge ruled against them, saying the wampums had lost their original significance and become relics and curiosities. So Marge Bruchac, reflecting on this situation, says that anthropological observers suggested that those wampum blossoms were indicative of cultural assimilation, factionalism, and the supposed privatization of regalia. So they were saying the argument was, no, I mean, people are already selling those. The culture has declined from what it was. These objects no longer have their meanings. And the evidence of that is the fact that they were sold in the first place. Marge is saying, no, that is actually this kind of strategic museumification of these objects, recasting them as objects that can be sold in the first place, recasting them as something that could be private property in order to justify the removal in the first place. She says, in fact, the losses were caused more by external than internal forces, including, I think she argues, and I would argue too, the very fact of their extraction, the very fact of their constant recreation into private objects that can be bought and sold, right? The kind of the ways that clips them, that removes them from the being able to have that kind of social force that they would have had in their original relational kinship mode of being in their community, and made instead into a relic, right? Something that belongs in the museum. So she suggests this is something called strategic alienation, which I find so useful. She says that one of the ways that strategic alienation works is through a number of ways. It can be removal. It can be detribalization. In this case, in 2009, the more recent case that turned out to be kind of make the exact same arguments as the one 100 years before, they said that because wampum belts could not be firmly identified with any one tribe, that they didn't belong to any tribe at all, right? So they can't be repatriated to one tribe because they've been detribalized, right? They have to belong to someone, and a culture is the only kind of entity that repatriation apparently is able to deal with. Anyway, museumification by itself is one of these factors in strategic alienation, as well as concealment, which just means there's concealing just deliberately through negligence or otherwise the documentation and the history of those actual objects in order to make them into relics that are kind of mysterious and open to be appropriated, right? Display is another way that we make objects other from ourselves, right? Display is a kind of relationship. It makes a certain relationship the case, and especially the relationship between an agent, someone who like thinks and moves and feels and owns things, and that which is owned, right? A division between ourselves and what would formerly be called perhaps a relative or something that works within our community and has a job within our community. It becomes instead something to be looked at and owned when we are put in that relationship to display. And then finally, exoticization, which I think is a familiar one as well. So in this kind of larger complex, Indigenous objects become evidence of the decline of their own cultures, justifying their removal, even as the decline is enforced through colonial policy. So again, in this case, and in other the cases of our interactions with other ethnographic museums, we kind of know what to do by now. This long history of this long struggle, Indigenous struggle within the museum, has resulted in specific language, policy, procedures. We know how to deal with these kinds of situations. And it's one of the strongest tools in our arsenal is repatriation. All right, so especially like NAGPRA in 1995, the museum's task force between 1992 and I believe it was published in 1996 in Canada. That's our kind of our NAGPRA up here. There was an agreement with all the museums in Canada. It wasn't legislated as it was in the United States, but it's still enforced here in Canada in this kind of like a consultative and collectively agreed upon way that objects, that human remains, cultural belongings, important things like wampum belts will be reunited with their communities, right? And then, of course, the things that we are still working on include restitution and revitalization of the actual cultural and social worlds that the extraction of these objects cut, right, that it injured. So this is a strategy within the Ethnographic Museum. I'm going to linger on this for a second, because I actually do think that this kind of logic of accumulation and this kind of this practice of strategic alienation, as outlined by Marge Bruchak in the case of these wampum belts, I think that we could make these comparisons with the art museum and the process by which our objects are excerpted from their social force in our communities, right? And then made into something that is owned and subject to certain kind of rules and certain kinds of control systems, which should be very familiar to us, but is harder to understand in the case of the art museum, because it is considered that inclusion in the art museum is its own goal. I don't think it has ever been that case. I don't think it's ever been the case for Indigenous artists or Indigenous curators or people who work in the museums that inclusion by itself was the goal to begin with. I think it has always been this process of making life livable again, right? To overcome these barriers that have actively excluded us from our own territories, and ways that our social life has been interrupted. I see the questions are starting to come in. I'll try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes, and then we can talk. We can talk a little bit more. I'm coming around to my point. Okay. So with that in mind, I think some of the ways, I just want to reflect on some of the ways that Indigenous artists have taken the museum as a frame and addressed it and worked within it. And then maybe we can talk, maybe you can open up the conversation for ways, because I don't have any answers yet, for ways that artists can resist this kind of colonial extraction that exists in the neutralization of their art objects and their voices into something that is in service of the colonial state, right? Of the settler society, which kind of neutralizes all of our activism into this expression of identity, right? As though it was only ever about like expressing ourselves on the world stage and not about actually fighting to exist in the ongoing struggles that we face today. So I'm going to think about some of the key architectural interventions, some of the key artworks that I think are important for thinking about these relationships with museums. One of the key people I look to, of course, is Marianne Nicholson, who is Kwakwaka'wakw from out west there. Who has a long history of doing these kind of architectural interventions, media-based projections, and also public art that addresses these kinds of colonial histories in a very direct way. But it's, I don't know, it's almost sneaky. Like you get commissioned to do a big piece of public art that contains within it critique. How do you make sure that critique lives and that it's not that the frame that the museum, that the settler colonial space continually tries to put around us in order to contain the kind of the potency of our claims, the potency of our art? How can you resist that frame, right? So this is an interesting piece in which she projected onto the facade of the, I believe, the Vancouver Art Gallery, which was formerly the provincial courthouse, where many of those, the people who had been arrested for potlatching, for instance, many of the policies under the Indian Act that criminalized dancing and creative acts and community acts in the first place, many of those were the criminalization kind of happened here. And so she's made this piece where she's converted the neoclassical facade of the museum of the former courthouse into the architecture of the Kwakwaka'wakw big house, right? And made a flag here, a sort of a reclaimed Canadian flag, which is itself a kind of from this kind of ghost ceremony in which the ghosts of the dead, of ghosts of something that has been rendered past and other and inert, is being called back into reality, right? She says, this quote from the ceremony was, "Come, ghosts, you whose night is day and whose day is night in this great house. I beg you, great healer, to take pity on us and restore us to life." To me, this just speaks to this matter of making those objects that are in the museum, those things that are relatives still, all right? Taking those and bringing them back into life, because I think there is that potential, not only through repatriation. I think there's other ways of reanimating those things, not only not as museum objects that come back and be put on display in the band council office, but as objects, as knowledge, as something that has been passed down from someone, from a foremother, right? The knowledge of how to make these things and how to be in good relation with the land, with each other, how to have those good life ways again. Those lessons are still in those objects and they're still available for us to learn from. And I think there are ways that contemporary artists are doing the work of questioning the relation that keeps us apart from that knowledge and from those ancestral beings, right? And then questions these histories of ongoing disconnection and extraction that we face not only at the Graphic Museum, but in the Art Museum, because both are expressions of power under a settler colonial state. Okay, I'm gonna end there actually. So I think we have about 10 minutes to take questions, but maybe to everyone for listening, and I hope we can have some productive conversations.
Thank you. That was amazing. We may have to pull up some of the images again, because some of the questions related to were specific in some spots. But before we get to questions, Alan, did you want to contribute with a few comments? I'll just track.
No, I just wanted to thank Mikinaak for that presentation, and then also I was also made me think a lot again about this post repatriation and what we do with anything that has been repatriated. And like actually the question I was going to ask, but you kind of addressed it, was what do we do with that instead of just putting it back up in the ban office? Or and then it kind of leads to a bigger question in the sense that it's what do we do with Native museums kind of thing. But I think that since we just got 10 minutes, I think it would be good to try and get the questions from those that have logged in.
Thank you, Al. So this is one of the questions, and I'm trying to recall exactly what where that was in the presentation. So Stephen says, removing an object from its active context may deprive it of its meaning. And he goes, yeah, so in agreement. Thinking that if it is an active dynamic context, there is possibly an animalistic spirit felt to be present. Like, is this something that you think about or agree, or what's your thoughts on that?
Actually, I think I spoke on this in another talk, but I'll just briefly start again. So the idea that an active object is one that has a spirit in it. Maybe. I think that's one of the ways that an object can considered to be active and might be worthy of our attention, right? And worthy of repatriation. I was struck by a conversation I had when I was working at an art museum, a major art institution, and we were doing we were bringing in objects for a show. I was part of the process of acquisition, but this was for a loan. And we asked, there are protocols in place, even though it's not an institution which has things which, well, some things may be repatriatable, but we still had protocols learned from these ethnographic kind of contexts about culturally sensitive museum protocols. We're like, okay, an object might come in, a contemporary art object might come in, which might need some of these care protocols, these special care protocols. So we were asking this one artist about this object, because we're like, okay, does it need protocols? Is it sacred? Is it sacred? Is it sacred? And the kind of assumption being that if it's sacred, it needs care, and if it's secular, it doesn't, right? And this artist just wouldn't answer. She's like, does it? And eventually I was just like, look, does it have a spirit? She's like, I don't want to answer. She's like, I don't know how to answer, and I don't want to answer because I still want you to take care of it. And then she went on and talked about all the ways that her brother had gone and gotten this moose, that it was made out of this certain moose hide, and no family still knows how to do all the tanning. All the ways that this object was related to her and important to her and required a kind of care that I don't think that our procedures accounted for. In that case, it was really interesting to me that the question of whether it has a spirit, why should that matter to us as the potential custodians, right? It might be something even as simple as that object was created by my mother, or was created with these kinds of knowledges. So objects in museums, do they have a spirit? Sometimes they might. You should be respectful of them just in case, right? The spirit might have passed on. It might have formerly had a spirit. But even if it doesn't, I think there's ways that these connections, these kinships in objects can be reanimated in a really useful way. Yeah. That's it.
Totally cool. Yeah, I have a zillion questions, but then the other one that came was, this was during Marianne Nicholson's piece when you were showing that. So the question was, interesting, if the weight of the use of art in museum is seen to be the norm, then what would be the alternative usage of the art if that were to be removed? Is it murals or living art, or?
Could you say that again? What the use would be?
What would then be the alternative usage of the art? But if it was going to be removed, I guess, from the museums, would it be murals or living art, or sort of to what Ellen's remarks, actually?
I guess so. I wasn't suggesting that there should not be any Indigenous art in museums. I'm saying that there's just a power dynamic in museums that tend to neutralize the creative potential, the life-giving potential and the anti-colonial potential of those artworks when they are kind of let alone to do their thing, right? I think there is important ways that Indigenous artists have found to kind of resist that or deflect that a little and to do their work anyway, right? And I think that I'm not going to make a series of recommendations. I'm not making an institutional critique again about what museums should do or should do differently. I'm saying I want to open a conversation for Indigenous people in order to broaden our discussion of the struggle in ethnographic museums that's ongoing about repatriation and everything, and actually bring that together with the art world conversations that are going on. Because I think that we need to nuance the way we look at inclusion in the art museum, because those same processes, I think, of neutralization of the social force of these objects is going on in the art museum. So I'm not saying take them down, send them home. I mean, that would be great. You know, a piece that the National Gallery just acquired, if it can send it home in different, like in a different loan, they can send it home, especially to a non-museum space, and kind of set aside their insurance values for a little while. That would be great. But in a larger sense, there's still kind of colonial power enforced there. How do we deflect that? How do we have curatorial strategies? How do we have ways of installing public art that resists these kinds of appropriations, right? I don't know. We're going to work on it, but I'm not suggesting we take all the Indigenous art down and don't show it anymore. Absolutely not.
I love
I
that.
was looking,
Oh, go ahead, Alan.
one of the things I guess that I was throughout your talk, I was thinking about, I know because both of us have done a lot of work in museums, but also galleries, but it kind of, to me, I've always looked at it as more that we're looking at not necessarily physical repatriation, but I always thought I was more into the knowledge repatriation.
Yeah.
And then also looking at, then that comes kind of, to me, in a sense, it seems like a tangent, but I think it's also germane, is that the purpose of the gallery slash museum, and whether it's actually, because like you said earlier, one of your slides was talking about people becoming citizens and being able to engage with masterpieces of art. But at the community level, then to look at these, try and engage with these masterpieces of art, they don't actually have that proximity to engage sometimes. So on the one hand, I guess I just wanted to see if you had any more thoughts about purposes, in a sense, of museums, galleries, ethnographic museums, art museums, that, from in that vein.
Yeah. Purposes of the art museum. I have a lot of thoughts on the matter. Yeah, maybe not something I can say in the next couple of minutes. I think that some of the ways that the ethnographic museum and the art museum have trimmed away those potential sites of connections, I think there's strategic ways to kind of bring those back into being and call them back into being a little bit. So you were talking about knowledge repatriation, right? While I still think that actually, like, classical repatriation is still kind of of primary importance, I'm very much interested in this kind of knowledge repatriation where we go back and we remake the things, because actually making those things and getting into that, the recalling those practices by which our foremothers kind of actually interact with the environment in order to make something life-giving, that is the real gift, and being able to carry that on is the real object, right? So that reaccumulating our stuff in tribal museums is not the same thing as decolonization, right? It's it's bringing all those things back feels like a way. It feels like a way that we're getting restitution. We're taking back everything that they took. We're taking back everything that they took. But then it comes back. Are you able to care for it anymore? Is it going to sit in our archives in the same way it was sitting in those archives in the metropolis? We need to be able to think of these things as potentially returned living people. Sometimes they might be being repatriated in order to be buried. Sometimes they've passed and that can't be reanimated. But being the potential for reanimation should be at the front of our mind every time we look at things. And I think it's the case in the art museum as well. I think it's interesting the ways that some communities the way that they've done repatriation is to ask that, okay, we'll sell this to you, but we want to come back and have it dance. We want to be able to dance it. We want to be able to borrow it whenever we need. We need to go dance it. We need you to not get on our asses about conservation issues, and then we're going to return it to you and you can put it back on display. Something like that, being able to have the object be in use still, like it's on a display, it's serving like a public education purpose, but then having it somehow be available to the community still to participate. That's, I think, is an interesting way that ancestral arts and contemporary arts that are based on those ancestral, those things can be useful. And I think that another interesting field that I think is comparable in the contemporary art situation is performance art, and objects that increasingly artists are kind of are able to make to maintain the relationships with the objects that they sell to institutions in interesting ways because of these performance art contracts, right? So that's another talk for another time, but I think that the increasing acceptance in the art world of performance art has become a platform, a way that the art museum is able to kind of wrap its head around allowing these kind of ongoing relationships with the object, so that, you know, the artist can borrow it in order to perform it somewhere else, or the artist has to be able to come in and like add something to the drawing every 5 years or so. Some way that an ongoing relationship to the object is kind of written into the agreement. I think that is one of the ways that we're seeing interesting progress being made, and I think it's comparable to the repatriation struggle.
I was also thinking of that performance art and the ephemeral nature of performance art.
Yeah.
And that the interesting thing is the initial slide, the picture you showed at the beginning of Rebecca Belmore,
Yeah.
like that photo is actually probably more an artifact now
Yeah.
than the actual performance. And like, so it makes me wonder,
It's
like
true.
the apron or whatever she's wearing of shell,
Yeah.
is that actually an artifact somewhere?
That's a
And
good
is
question.
the frame and the actual signs, are they anywhere? And so this picture, in a sense, actually is a piece of art now, can be either considered a piece of art or a transmission of knowledge of a historical event as
Right.
well.
What would be the function of those objects? Would they be able to still perform as
Yeah.
do the work of like speaking to against the power of these kind of these cages, these boxes? Would it still be able to do that as an object in a museum? I don't know where the objects are, but I know Rebecca Belmore is someone who has a long history of thinking about and trying to defy those kinds of extractions in the art world context. So I'm not sure what she would think of having that object accessioned, if it even still around. But and then there's the image itself, this picture that
Yeah.
this grainy picture itself. What kind of life this object has is interesting of itself. Yeah. Wait, I don't know if I answered your question or just rambled more, but we're getting to that point.
It wasn't really a question, I guess, either.
Oh,
per
okay.
se. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a discussion and dialogue, which is great. And yes, it's a little bit after 2, and I want to thank people for staying tuned. I love that. Like, things were going through my mind, like the idea of wanting people's art, but not the people. Like, it makes me think about the Indigenous knowledge context. Let's just extract this knowledge from people, but forget about their rights. Like, who cares, right? And then the idea of the, in the Aboriginal and Treaty Rights litigation or assertions of Indigenous people, you have to show this continuity, and art's one of the ways to do that. And so there's just this idea of culture that Indigenous peoples are always having to account for, but it's always other people's ideas about what that is, but you always have to prove this thing. So I just had all these notes, but I'm not going to go through them and try to summarize or like my thoughts on this amazing talk and ways of thinking about this. But I'm sort of left with the question, and I don't expect you to be able to answer that, is like, what do we put up there instead of that Ryerson statue?
Oh my God. I went by there the other day I went with Maria, and we went to go see, because I think it's productive sometimes when these monuments come down and the plinth stays, to say there was something here, especially with all that writing on it, right? This space has been reclaimed, right? This has been a site of where our collective grief made something happen in the public sphere. I like when those empty plinths are left there. But actually Ryerson took it down like pretty much immediately. They're like, oh my God, I know they're still grappling with do we change the name? Do we change the name? I think there's a really simple answer there, and I think the answer to that is as simple as the demonstrators that took down the statue have proven it to be, right? So, yeah.
I think what it does is just opens up the possibilities, right? Like, because it's not
Possibilities.
there, so then there's possibilities, and people can actually use their imagination and decide some things. Yeah.
I find the plaque solution to be falls very short, especially when it's like it always becomes such a compromised solution. People are like, well, why don't we make this a lesson? Why don't we make this old racist exhibition instead of deinstalling it? We'll put a plaque on it. We'll help people. We'll help educate people about how things used to be. And actually, putting a frame around things, as we know, tends to neutralize the political force and the fact that it's still ongoing. It puts it in the past and makes it seem as though it's not still ongoing. And also, people miss that anyway. This kind of meta critique layered on top. I don't find it very effective. So we need a Rebecca Belmore in front of every museum in the cage just to make sure people know. They're like, oh, you're right. That's a screwed up dynamic. Or something with a little more force than a plaque would be great.
Plaque solution. That's your next paper or next presentation.
Yeah, I joke. We're like, every committee ever, well, let's stick a plaque on it. Unless somebody, who was it that said, it was Cyrus Ware. He says, listen, unless that plaque is big enough to cover the statue, it's insufficient.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to future engagement. So thrilled that you're, just a subway ride down once I actually feel enough confidence to be riding around in the subway.
I'm back in town.
Yeah. And so I really want to thank you for agreeing to be part of this. So Miigwech for that. And nice to touch base with you. Yay, get to see you in some sort of context. Yeah.
I'm going to throw this screen up real quick. Here's some of the artist collectives that I was talking about. So please feel free to check these guys out. They're doing important work as artists against settler colonialism.
I think probably a lot of folks have seen Thunderbolt Woman, but didn't necessarily know kind of what that's about. So
check out Onaman Collective, support their work. Indigenous Kinship Collective, and Decolonize This Place. All right, Miigwech.
Miigwech. Alan, did you have any closing comments? I'm just so thrilled. What a thrill to have Mikinaak here. And I like where that name came from. Now I'm cluing in, so it's great. Oh.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything further to add. I think that it's good to let Crystal have the last word.
Okay, Crystal has last word. She gave us a list, and I'm talking. I keep doing this. I'll stop. Miigwech. Miigwech. Miigwech, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Miigwech. Balmoti. Do they turn off the stream?
Yes, we're